Hi everyone, my name is Alice. I'm the Director for Library Programming and Public Affairs, and we're really excited today to have a guest speaker who's going to be talking to us about illegal migrations in Western Europe. I'll bring up Dr. Mina Sarouche to give the introduction.
Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. How are you? On this beautiful Thursday, thank you for coming. Welcome, welcome. As people come in, I just want to thank you for coming today. And today we're delighted to have Ms. Federica Di Blasio speak to us about her work. But first I would like to begin by thanking Divisional Dean Dr. Paul Began in International Studies and Languages for his support in bringing Ms. Di Blasio here today. Dr. Began can't be with us today, and I thank him in his absence. And I would also like to thank the Pepperdine Libraries, co-sponsor for this event, who serves as our host for Ms. Di Blasio's talk, in particular Dean Mark Russa and Alice Tsai, Director of Library Programming. I'm happy to introduce our speaker today. Federica Di Blasio is a PhD candidate and teaching fellow in the Department of Italian at UCLA. She studied comparative literature at the University of Bologna in Italy, the University of Tours in France, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She has published on French author Georges Perec and presented her work on contemporary narratives of migration in the Mediterranean at several conferences. Her dissertation analyzes representations of mobility and aesthetic approaches to globalization in Italian literature and cinema, including authors from the fascist period to the present. The UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies generously supported her research at the French-Italian border in the summer of 2017. Her talk today is entitled Passeurs, Narrating Illegal Migrations in Europe, World War II to the Present. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Di Blasio.
Thank you so much, Mina, for this introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to share my research with you today. So this presentation is part of an article that is going to be published in the California Italian Studies Journal within the next month. As you might guess, there are many ways to study illegal migrations that are such a huge and key phenomenon of our time. Being a literary scholar, my approach focuses on narratives of illegal migration. So I study how certain subjects involved in these practices are portrayed. So my work can be interpreted as a response to public accounts, official accounts on illegal migrations that we hear from many populist parties that are in the rise in the US and in Europe. And I'm going to start with a reference to the Italian main populist leader today, Matteo Salvini, who has been particularly insistent on not only addressing migrants with racist tones, but also depicting migrant smuggling as a criminal activity to reinforce his anti-migrant political agenda. In particular, Matteo Salvini has systematically, since summer 2018, refused entrance to NGO boats seeking permission to take rescued migrants to ports in Italy. He has attacked NGOs' credibility by labeling them taxi services for human traffickers and denouncing what he views as the complicity between the human traffickers and NGOs. This xenophobic cartoon, which circulates among Salvini's supporters on Twitter, synthesizes his vision. Racially caricatured, repulsive figures of migrants are seen here complaining in broken Italian that their taxi service is no longer available under Salvini. We also see an info point, so here, that looks like a parasite or an alien trying to get in touch with the Vatican, another target of Salvini's propaganda due to the pro-migrant stand of Pope Francis. In extending the criminal status of human traffickers to NGOs committed to saving human lives in the Mediterranean, Salvini has delegitimized the NGO's mission and distorted the complexity of illegal migration. In essence, he has blurred the differences between legal and illegal, humanitarian and for-profit, which results in an oversimplified account of illegal migration practices. Salvini has also used the category of traffickers as a generalized definition for anyone helping migrants to cross borders illegally. He has confirmed this misguided generalization by stating that whoever helps undocumented migrants betrays Italy and the Italian people. Salvini takes advantage of a common belief held on both sides of the political spectrum about smugglers being the only subjects responsible for migrant death and abuses against them. As the European Commission reports, migrant smuggling is one of the most profitable illegal activities of the contemporary era, worth billions of euros. Smugglers operate on land, sea, and air, outside and within the borders of Europe. While they figure as third parties in the migrants crossing of European borders, smugglers are associated to a variety of threats to European security, ranging from terrorism to human trafficking and money laundering. The criminal activities of smugglers have been the main target of several European institutions' commitment to border security policies. However, with the harshening of European security measures, the smuggling industry has become more sophisticated. Meanwhile, the causes that make smuggling services so popular have hardly changed. In a book, in a sociological study on human smuggling networks between Europe, Asia, and Africa, journalist Piero Tinti and sociologist Tuesday Reitano question simplistic interpretations of the smugglers as outlaws. They write, and I'm going to read the quote, "It is certainly true that smugglers profit from the desperation of others. But it is also true that in many cases, smugglers save lives, create possibilities, and redress global inequalities." End of quote. Smugglers thrive because there is high demand for their services, and most migrants lack alternative legal ways to cross borders. As a humanities scholar, I'm interested in understanding the ambiguity of the smuggler's role and how their representations change and can be manipulated for the sake of a political narrative. I have turned to literature and cinema and to some narrative reportage and historical accounts to look for more complex representations of the smuggler's role in illegal migration. I felt my goal was to investigate the figure of the human smuggler as an internal and historical component of European culture, rather than as merely the external threat suddenly posed by the contemporary migratory crisis. As a test case, I focused on a specific borderland of Europe, the crest of the Western Alps connecting France and Italy and Switzerland, where Italian and French are the main spoken languages. I have found significant narratives that present smugglers as their central figures, and these are the narratives I'm going to present and talk about today. These narratives range from documentaries to biographies, from journalistic reportage to fiction novels. I have used a chronological approach, tracing the evolution of perception of smugglers within the borders of Europe. My thesis is that literary and cinematic narratives of human smugglers across the Western Alps show a more multifaceted representation of these outlaw figures that may help demystify and correct the current populist rhetoric. In these narratives, political, humanitarian, and environmental values complicate and help question the current generalized criminalization of smugglers and their reduction to an external threat to European values, history, and identity. So going back to the map, the Western Alps connecting Switzerland, France, and Italy are a particularly arduous landscape. Climate and altitude make it hard to cross the mountains, especially without the help of experienced alpine guides, especially in the winter. At sea level, along the crest of the maritime Alps, cliffs descend abruptly into the Mediterranean, making even agricultural activities strenuous. Nevertheless, it is because of this particular landscape and the difficulties in patrolling that migrants keep attempting to climb when other ways to cross borders are unavailable. Smugglers, or passeurs, as they're called in French, and often also in Italian, have been a long-established tradition in this region. Archivist Simonetta Tombaccini-Villefranc uses the material of the Maritime Alps Department's archive to discover how passeurs' identities, means, and motivations have varied according to the geopolitical evolution of the borderland. She explains how smugglers of goods and people have always existed at the border between Italy and France, but it was in the 1920s that the figure of professional passeur became more common. Locals were the best guides to cross the border, as they had excellent knowledge of the borderland's geography. Additionally, they often held special border passports. Later, older generations of immigrants helped new migrants from their family or their hometown. More sophisticated criminal organizations of smugglers also came from these forms of distant cooperation. The film Il Cammino della Speranza, The Path of Hope in English, by Italian director Pietro Germi from 1950, shows how these criminal organizations used to operate and how they would defraud migrants from destitute areas of Italy, such as Sicily, Abruzzo, or Calabria. Germi was inspired by the true story of 50 Sicilian migrants who were found lost on the Western Alps mountains in 1946. They had sold all their property in Sicily and trusted a guide that should have brought them to France to work. And in the film, the guide is the figure that you see at the center, so this one. In fact, the alleged passeur abandoned the migrants way before approaching the border. In Germi's film, the smugglers' cowardice and brutality are opposed to the pathos of the migrant story and serve as a contrast. The drama caused by the smugglers' misdeed only finds a somewhat utopian resolution when a young boy traveling with the migrants smiles at the French border guards and moves them to the point that they finally allow the Sicilians to pass. Germi's smuggler is a negative figure subordinated to the plot of the migrant's search for happiness. The reason why he's so despicable, however, is more related to his unreliability as a passeur than to his own outlaw status, which he shares with the migrants. Other narratives in historiography and fiction show positive figures of passeurs and the migrants' gratitude to their professional guides. During fascism, as Tombaccini-Villefranc recalls, many Italians opposing the regime left Italy through a trusted network of anti-fascists, joining the so-called category of fuoriusciti. Later, after Mussolini established the anti-Semitic race laws in 1938, many Jews crossed the Western Alps to seek refuge in France and Switzerland. Historian Renata Brogini has collected letters and journals where Jewish refugees report different experiences with smugglers, helping them cross the border into Switzerland. Many of them were robbed of their belongings. Some were arrested by the Swiss border guards, but there were also several expressions of gratitude. At that time, political idealism seemed to guide the most trustworthy smugglers that could combine the search for profit with their commitment to anti-fascism. An exemplary figure of this sort appears in Vuoto alle spalle, The Void Behind, the 1999 biographical novel on Ettore Castiglioni by Italian writer and journalist Marco Ferrari. Ettore Castiglioni was born in 1908. He was a lawyer from Milan, though mainly known for his career as an alpinist. He was the author of several alpine guides and inaugurated more than 200 new climbing paths over the Alps and in Patagonia. For his athletic merits, Castiglioni received a gold medal from Mussolini, though he later became an active opponent to the regime. After the armistice of 1943, which led to Italy's alignment with the Allies, Castiglioni benefited from his position as a climbing instructor at the military school of Aosta, which led to him joining the resistance. He became the leader of a group of 12 alpinists living on cheese smuggling and serving as passeurs for anti-fascists at the Swiss-Italian border. On September 26, 1943, Ferrari helped the future president of the Italian Republic, Luigi Einaudi, to cross the Swiss-Italian border with his wife, Ida. In the novel, Ferrari presents Ettore Castiglioni as a sensitive and idealistic passeur who embraces the values of anti-fascist resistance while also idealistically pursuing a kind of absolute freedom. Incorporating passages from Castiglioni's journals, Ferrari shows Castiglioni's empathy for refugees and his altruistic commitment to his activity as a passeur. Castiglioni felt he could simultaneously serve as the general cause of anti-fascism and support his small community of alpinists. For this purpose, he would allocate the tips given by refugees to a common fund for the community. His strong leadership was crucial for the group that dissolved once Castiglioni was put in prison. Throughout the novel, Ferrari insists on Castiglioni's relationship with the landscape and how this influenced his activity as a passeur. This relationship can be seen as twofold. First, as an attachment to the Alps and the older generations of passeurs whose knowledge Castiglioni inherited. Second, as a broader dedication to mountains and wild nature. In the novel, Castiglioni is seen as a part of a network including Italian politicians Federico Chabot and Paolo Alfonso Fariné. In particular, thanks to Fariné, Castiglioni has access to the precious knowledge that generations of passeurs from the valley accumulated over the years. How to see in the dark, how to deal with animals, how to treat customs officers. The Fenêtre de Durand that you can see in the map, so it's this one, where Castiglioni operated as a passeur, had served as a secret passage since ancient times, and there have indeed been as many generations of fugitives, including John Calvin in 1536, as generations of passeurs. If Castiglioni's knowledge of the Alps connect him to the past of the previous inhabitants, his philosophy of alpinism and his relationship with the wilderness more generally seems to point to his exceptionality and to set him apart from the human community. What is more, Ferrari suggests this particular aspect of Castiglioni's relationship with wild landscapes can actually explain the mysterious circumstances of Castiglioni's death. On June 5, 1944, Castiglioni was found dead in the Forno Glacier, apparently killed by a storm while he was attempting to cross the Swiss-Italian border, equipped only with a blanket and a pair of slippers. There was evidence that Castiglioni had been arrested in Switzerland, where he was not allowed to enter, caught using a false passport. He was therefore detained in a hotel room while waiting to be transferred to prison the following day. At that point, in the snowy night of March 11, 1944, Castiglione decided to attempt crossing the border despite the fact that officers had deprived him of his shoes and pants. Ferrari finds himself at a loss as to why Castiglione decided to run away from the Swiss officers who arrested him and why he attempted to cross the border without proper equipment, being a talented and wise alpinist. He supports the argument that it was Castiglione's very idea of alpinism that must have pushed him to attempt such an impossible mission. His search for the sublime, his need to establish an exclusive connection with nature. According to Ferrari, the concept behind Castiglione's philosophy of alpinism is that nothing wrong can happen in nature. In Ferrari's romantic interpretation of Castiglione's death, the Alps lose their historical identity and become part of a larger expression of the wild, the inhuman, and the immense. Ferrari builds an uplifting narrative in his biographical novel where Castiglione the Passeur is an exceptional figure, morally upstanding and responsible for his community, but at the same time unique and inimitable due to his solitary, idealistic search for the absolute. Yet political idealism is not the only feature of a good passeur, a traditional profession in European internal borderlands for centuries. We find important insights into passeur professional ethics in the short novels published in the 80s and 90s by Francesco Biamonti, a writer from Liguria like Italo Calvino that you might know, who first wrote about him. Framed as crime stories, Biamonti's novels have nonetheless set the tone for a specific kind of borderland literature in Italian. Biamonti's fiction is carefully grounded in the specific French-Italian borderlands landscape and its history, and provides an effective depiction of illegal migration and of passeurs. In his first novel, L'Angelo da Rig, The Angel from a Rig from 1983, for example, Biamonti connects the mystery of a murder to the death of a migrant from Eastern Europe several years earlier who was abandoned by his passeur while attempting to cross the cliff called Death Path, one of the most deadly passages at the French-Italian border. And you can see it on the map here at the bottom. Situated on the Gironde promontory, the Death Pass connects Grimaldi, the peripheral area of Ventimiglia, to the French town of Menton. Going down the cliff on the French side of this pass is the most difficult part, and this pass is still very traveled today, seeing the passages of migrants of many nationalities. So this is a picture that I personally took when I visited the French-Italian border in 2017. The picture was taken from the Italian side. So you see, you need to cross this cliff in order to reach the French side that is on the back, and this is the city, the town of Menton, also behind the rock. The last Italian migrant to die falling from this cliff was Mario Trambusti, a Florentine baker who attempted to cross the path in 1962. The most recent fatal accident on record is that of a non-identified African migrant found dead on the French side of the cliff on March 21st, 2017. Biamonti's 1999 novel Vento Largo, Open Wind, gives even further importance to the figure of the passeur to signify a particular bond with the territory and its past. The protagonist, Vary, is an occasional passeur who at the beginning of the novel is shocked by the death of his former colleague and friend, Andrea. Andrea and Vary belong to the same generation of passeurs, coming from the Ligurian mountainous inner land and attached to the same value system. For both Vary and Andrea, an honest passeur is one who does not abandon migrants until they reach the other side of the border. After Andrea's death, it is Vary who takes charge of two migrants, a Bulgarian man and a Romanian woman, proving to be as honest and trustworthy as he thought Andrea to be. He does not ask for extra money since they had already paid Andrea before his death. He takes them to France safely and gives them his address so that they can contact him after their arrival. But he takes on the migrants because he does not trust the passeurs from the seaside. The distinction between good and bad passeurs is quite simple for Vary. Inland passeurs like him, passeurs from the mountains to be sure, are trustworthy, while the new passeurs coming from the coast are not. Rather than getting involved in drug trafficking with them, Vary ends up quitting his profession entirely. Throughout his work, Biamonti laments the end of Ligurian agricultural civilization and values, and the social desolation deriving from urban development, depopulation, and illicit trafficking. Nothing has replaced what he calls the old civilization of the olive tree, and Vary is alone contemplating what is lost. Similarly, in Biamonti's last novel, Le parole la notte, The Words the Nights, waves of refugees scare local people who cannot grasp what is happening around them. The protagonist, Leonardo, who is not a passeur but thinks as if he were one, offers protection to refugees under the shade of his olive trees. Overall, the passeur in Biamonte is the man who experiences a moral crisis and finally quits his profession, yet he keeps cherishing the passeur's professional ethics, especially when confronted with migrants. Sicilian historian Enzo Barnaba, whom I met when I was doing research at the French-Italian border, has been particularly committed to promoting and preserving the historical relevance of the death pass. Barnaba has written books and participated in TV shows to recall the importance of the death pass in the history of Italian emigration, and he has also been promoting measures to secure the death pass, trying to avoid further accidents. So if you think about it, about 250 people died trying to cross that pass, I want to say in the last maybe 70 years. He has been collecting the traces of migrant passages on this trail, such as this list of European telephone contacts that I can show you. And this directive to leave the French soil that migrants must have lost during the crossing. Material traces of migrants on the Death Pass Trail, abound, and they're particularly easy to be found in the summertime. While in Grimaldi, Barnaba also gave me directions to see Casegina, the ruins of old houses abandoned since 1944, which passeurs have since used to conceal migrants. And you can see pictures that I also took while I was there. The location of these ruins overlooking the sea, the trash and the graffiti that migrants leave make of this site a kind of monument of illegal border crossing. The graffiti in particular is a heterogeneous ensemble of text, prayers, obscene drawings, love messages written in many languages during many waves of migration occurring at least since the 80s. So because of this graffiti, we can actually figure out when these migrants passed and left their mark. So for example, here it's pretty evident, it's 1997. I personally was able to read dates at least since the 80s. As you can see in this last picture, the curse mort au passeur, so it's here and here, is repeated twice in Arabic. It's repeated twice in French, among many texts in Arabic. Rumors among locals connect these curses to a pedophile passeur operating in the area many years ago. Another graffiti in Arabic reporting the death of more than 250 victims during the tragic shipwreck in the Mediterranean of October 11th, 2013, which you can see here, leads to the next narrative in my analysis, the documentary Io sto con la sposa, On the Bright Side by Gabriele Del Grande, Khaled Suleiman Al-Naziri, and Antonio Augugliaro from 2014, to which Barnaba contributed as the guide to the Death Pass. Io sto con la sposa is the fruit of a successful fundraising campaign. With the contribution of almost 2,500 donors, Del Grande and his co-directors reached a budget of 98,000 euros and succeeded in presenting the film at the Venice Film Festival. Io sto con la sposa narrates a real act of political dissent. A group of European activists becomes the cortege of a fake marriage between Syrian-German activist Tasnit Fared and Syrian asylum seeker Abdallah Salam. Along with the Europeans, another 4 Syrian asylum seekers joined the group. The wedding is a ruse that will eventually allow the migrants to reach Sweden, where they wish to claim political asylum. The film focuses on the Syrian diaspora caused by the war that Del Grande was able to witness in person as a journalist. It unfolds by superimposing 2 different narratives, one related to the migrants' lives, their past, and their hopes for the future, and the other one narrating the journey that takes the cortege from Milan to Stockholm. As Del Grande explains, the goal of the film is to express what he calls a new aesthetics of the border that may humanize the migrants without necessarily transforming them into victims and objects of pity. While the film narrates the horror of war and the escape to Europe, insisting on the Syrians' emotions, their memories and tears, it challenges the presumptions that these people are not able to be happy or celebrate and live their lives to the fullest. Being protagonists of the film, with their own hopes and desires, the Syrian asylum seekers are made equal to the European subjects who decide to share the risks taken along their journey to Sweden. The film's narrative is about a new possible subjectivity, a new we, celebrating the strength of a confident anti-racist solidarity. Io sto con la sposa is a deeply transnational film for the engagement of a multilingual, diverse crew and for representing a journey across different borders of Europe. From Italy to France, from France to Germany, passing through Luxembourg, from Germany to Denmark, and from Denmark to Sweden. Yet the French-Italian border is prominent in the film. Not only is it the first border to be crossed, but it is also the history of this borderland that comes out most strongly and has an important role in the conception of this film. After choosing the wedding dress and having their hair cut, the group of asylum seekers meet the other components of the group in a private house in Milan. There, Del Grande and Al-Naziri introduce themselves and explain the rationale behind their project. They have a map in front of them to study the first part of their journey from Milan to Marseille. Del Grande explains that they will pass through the old border, and he says that border is a mountain passage used by Italians where they still used to travel without a passport. 50 years ago, the illegal immigrants to France were Italians. That path still exists today, end of quote. The path that Grande refers to is indeed the death pass above Ventimiglia. It takes them several hours to cut a hole in the barbed wire dividing the 2 countries and make it across the border. This image is so evocative that it was chosen to promote the film, while a picture of the same crossing also appears on the official poster. The graffiti on the 2013 shipwreck that Abdallah Salam writes during the shooting leaves a permanent mark of the cruise stop at Casegina that you can see on the picture that I showed earlier. The history of the French-Italian border and of Italian illegal immigration into France is important in triggering the identification process on which Del Grande and Al-Naziri ground their act of solidarity. They too explain how they strongly oppose the deeds of untrustworthy passeurs who tricked their migrants, abandoning them in remote areas of the Alps after receiving their money. This kind of fraud is so common that it is in fact what motivated the directors to make this film. Del Grande's condemnation of opportunistic and treacherous passeurs is very similar to Biamonti's critique and to Pietro Germi's. Yet, in contrasting good and bad passeurs, Justo con la Sposa takes on a playful tone as if being masqueraded as attendants of a wedding party allowed the participants to treat their mission with a degree of amusement as well as with determination. In representing the passeurs of Justo con la Sposa as humane European citizens, the film also clearly implies that the only way to stop the bloodbath in the Mediterranean Sea is for Europe to offer concrete legal alternatives of mobility to people escaping from war. Very similar to the account of the public act of disobedience in Justo con la Sposa is French journalist Raphael Kraft's story of border crossing, published in his 2017 reportage entitled Passeurs. Like Del Grande, Kraft is not a professional passeur, but he gets involved in the migrants' drama and decides to serve as a passeur for two Sudanese young men, Satellite and his friend Adele. In his reportage, Kraft integrates notes on the dismantlement of refugee camps in Paris and Ventimiglia with the narrative of his encounters with Enzo Barnabà and French activist Hubert Jourdan. Barnabà and Jourdan are Kraft's main contacts and his hosts on the two sides of the border. However, they're also morally strong figures against whom Kraft measures himself, taking inspiration for his own behavior. Barnabà is a historian, an old militant of the Communist Party and a migrant from Sicily, and Jourdan is a spiritualist, philanthropist, and connoisseur of Middle Eastern and Eastern countries. Like Justo con la Sposa, Kraft's text advocates a universal right to mobility and compliance with the international laws that France agreed to, along with other European countries. While Del Grande and his co-directors contrast themselves to fraudulent passeurs and let the migrants themselves raise their voices against European governments' attitudes and immoral behavior, Kraft develops a self-scrutiny as a human being and a French citizen. It is first of all the damaged image of France and what he calls the European honor that pushes Kraft to take action. The landscape he chooses for the crossing is particularly significant. It is called the Fenêtre, that again you can see on the map, so it's here, where a memorial plaque recalls the migration of Jewish refugees during World War II. The plaque is in French and Italian. I'm going to read the translation in English. Through this passage in September 1943, hundreds of Jews from all Europe tried to escape from anti-Semitic persecution. You who walk freely, remember that this happened when you tolerate that other people are deprived of the rights that you enjoy. Like the graffiti in Casegina, the memorial plaque on Col de Fenêtre is important in establishing a connection with past cases of migration. Kraft recalls previous passages suggesting how the need to migrate is essentially a constant of human history. Migrations have been involving different peoples and have been occurring for many different reasons, all legitimate. In both Justo con la Sposa and Passeurs, the narrative ends with an update on the migrant status and their request for asylum. While they could not guarantee asylum to all the migrants involved in their narratives, the authors have produced powerful arguments for the defense of the migrants' rights. In their works, the figure of Passeurs stands as an example of humanitarian engagement and political activism. Grande's and Kraft's narratives thus overcome the impasse of Biamonte's Passeur, who is aware of the political and social decadence surrounding him, but unable to point to possible solutions or take action. Insisting on a temporal continuity connecting the present and the past, Grande and Kraft do not present exceptional Passeur figures, such as Castiglioni, but rather highlight the exceptionality and exemplarity of certain gestures. They support political activists being prosecuted for so-called crimes of solidarity, such as Lisa Bossia-Mirra, prosecuted by Swiss authorities, and Cédric Herroux, who has been active at the French-Italian border and had to face several arrests and convictions in France for assisting migrants. In conclusion, the different genres and approaches to the figure of the passeur operating across the Western Alps in literature, cinema, and non-fiction, which I've presented, show how human smugglers are not at all extraneous to European culture. Rather, human smuggling was a traditional profession in internal borderlands of Europe and a political necessity during World War II. During the years of the contemporary migration crisis, many European authors have felt the need to reconnect the present with the history and tradition of professional and anti-fascist passeurs. Their narratives show how human smuggling, far from being always a form of abuse and criminal business, may be and has historically also been a way to express political dissent and humanitarian compassion. In either case, traffickers and smugglers are first of all the symptoms of an inadequate management of migration, whereby individuals feel the need or find the opportunity to act illegally, while an efficient, systematic, and humane response to migrants' needs on the part of European governments is still lacking. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federica. I'd like to open it up to questions.
Thank you for your presentation. Oh, sorry. So I teach American politics, so this is way outside of my area of expertise. But I was just thinking about the current narrative about smugglers coming from the Trump administration. And I'm wondering if the experience of World War II and the narrative of Jewish migration makes possible a more positive image of smugglers because of that history. So is it even possible for that kind of narrative in the United States where there isn't that historical experience that everybody looks back at now and says that was a noble thing to do, it was the right thing to do? And it seems like some of the stories you talked about either specifically talked about that event or connected the contemporary situation to that event.
Yes, but thank you so much for this comment and question. Yes, absolutely. I think that's what's going on in this text, that they all refer to World War II as a time when being a passeur was actually a good thing, a noble thing to do. Unfortunately, I don't know about American narratives in the American context, but it's certainly a great comparison. What is happening in European politics now is that actually many, especially populist leaders, have been refusing that history and just negating that history as if that never happened. So I think for the special case of European illegal migration, it's kind of inaccurate to portray passeurs or smugglers or something that come from outside and we've never experienced. But it's certainly true that all these narratives are very much grounded in the history of that specific borderland. So what I would do is really look at the specific cases and see what happens, see what is the history of that borderland and how these narratives combine different give different accounts of that specific history. But thank you so much for that comment.
First of all, thank you so much for coming and speaking to us. And my question for you is, what made you come here to the U.S.?
What? Okay. I was not expecting a personal question. I want to say the kind of work I do, because I applied for a PhD program. First I applied for a master's program in Illinois and then a PhD program. And yeah, definitely my research has brought me here to the US. I would have never thought about moving to the US before because my first experiences abroad were in France. So I've always thought it's much more likely for me, if anything, to move to France. I lived there for 2 years, and then it just happened. I came to the US. You never know. In life, you never know.
Federica, do you mind speaking more about your time on the French-Italian border and maybe some of the interviews you conducted and a general sentiment of what the locals kind of as observers and maybe keepers of the history, kind of what was your sense out of those interactions?
Yeah, so I went to the French-Italian borders thanks to the UCLA Center for European and Russian Studies who funded my research. And that was in July 2017. It was a very, very touching and interesting experience for me because I was already working on narratives like texts that I could read from here or films that I could watch from here. But then when I went there, I was able to learn about many other narratives that were more local and I had never heard about. It was very, very helpful to talk to the locals, the local people, and they had me both finding this text, but also understanding the kind of borderland culture that they live in their everyday life. So for example, the story I mentioned about the pedophile passeur, there is no evidence that that happened. I was told that story, somebody living there, born and raised there, told me, I heard about this story, but it's just rumors. I don't know if they're true or not, but I think they might be because, why would they talk about this if there was not some kind of truth there? So that was one thing for the specific goal of analyzing these narratives. And then I also talked to activists. Enzo Barnaba is one of those. As I said, he's an historian, he writes books, but he's also trying to secure that path. And the picture I showed you shows there. So he's trying to put just traces, like signs for the migrants to know where to go and where not to go. Migrants and anybody, because this is an open space, so everybody can actually cross. And then other people I met, well, certainly Maria Paola Rottino, a very interesting figure because he manages a nonprofit association in Ventimiglia. And she was involved in the in the management of the migrant crisis, especially in 2015, when there was a peak of the migrant crisis in Ventimiglia. There were protests on the rocks, on the beach of Ventimiglia, on the rocks. Migrants stayed there for many days. International, like activists from everywhere, from other countries gathered in Ventimiglia as a form of protest. But actually forms of activism happen in that border from both sides of the political spectrum. So I have a picture, for example, that I can show you. This is a protest of right-wing activists from 2018, but they were trying to really express their refusal, like their ideas of closed borders. I did not talk to these people, but just to give you an idea of how active that borderland is. And even like the person who hosted me, I was staying in an Airbnb, even that person who was not involved into this at all, she was actually active. She was active in a religious organization and helping migrants. So my impression was that everybody living in the borderland is affected somehow. and they all take strong positions. They're pretty radical about their positions because their everyday life is affected by that. Cédric Caroux, another person I personally I met when I was there, and he's been through a lot of trials. As you can see, there were also news, I think, on the New Yorker here or the New York Times, something like that. But his case is pretty known in France and abroad. But yeah, that's the impression I had. The history that it's making itself in this borderland, and even if it's a very peripheral area of both France and Italy, but it's really the center of all these nationalist discourses or political activism. Thank you.
Hi, first of all, thank you for coming to present to us. My question was, since it seems that the cases that you've presented are all individualist cases of small-scale immigration from countries, how do you think this is disanalogous to the concerns that groups like Salvini supporters or Identity Europa or groups like that have, that mass migration is unique because of the demographic changes that it could bring to their countries?
So you're referring to the demographics of migrants or smugglers?
Sorry. Right, so a lot of these groups, like a lot of the rhetoric coming from Le Pen types or Salvini types, is that these sorts of instances are different because mass migration specifically comes with the added challenges of changing demographics for the countries. So do you think that's disanalogous, and how would you respond to claims that that's disanalogous to the work of passeurs?
I'm not 100% sure I understood your question, so let me rephrase it and let me know if I didn't get it. So you're saying that this new populist parties emerging today, Salvini, Le Pen, they talk about a new, like a shift in mass migration because the migration happening now, it's so intense and has such a large proportion that it's been changing the European demographics, whereas it was not the case before. Is it correct? It's hard to answer that question because I'm not a specialist of the sociology of migration, so I don't have data to compare. I would say migrations, to me, that's just a personal opinion, migrations look all the same to me at different times. And there are changes that come with migrations, of course. It doesn't mean it's a bad thing, you know? So this is my opinion on that. I think what is new and very unique about the migration we see now is the treatment that this migration gets from the media. And even the idea of presenting this migration as a huge crisis is something that it might be accurate because it's true that we have never had so many refugees or asylum seekers since World War II. But at the same time, just presenting this issue as a crisis has a lot of problematic aspects because there's the idea that there's not a way to find systematic solutions to that problem, or to have like a structure in welcoming this migrants. So the rhetoric of the emergency of the crisis, I don't think it's very useful. Or we should go past, like we should overcome that phase and realize that migrations are normal and laws can change too, because being outlaw or lawful, it's not necessarily what makes you think that you're doing the right thing or not. So our ethical perception of migration can change based on the circumstances. But again, that's just my personal take.
Hi.
Hi.
So you spoke a little bit earlier about the rhetoric about migrants and how that's
negatively portrayed a lot of times. And looking like forward in the future, are you hoping to see maybe a rise or a shift to a non-populist or non-populist leaders in the future in Europe? Or do you think maybe it'll take more ground-up media portrayal?
I don't know, like based on the news, it seems very hard now because populism is so much in the rise now, and in so many countries, not only Europeans. Totally. It's sad that this very simplistic rhetorics are the answer to I don't think, I would not say migration is not a problem. This is not what I'm suggesting. What I'm suggesting is that it's a very, very complex phenomenon, and we need to give very, very complex or sophisticated responses to this phenomenon. And just, it's too easy to say that smugglers or NGOs are just friends or taxi services for migrants. This is not, it might be true that there are some negative effects of the way NGOs work, so that's one way of looking at it, but saying that they're just there to help traffickers, it's different. And also the distinction between traffickers and smugglers should always be clear, because traffickers exploit migrants. There is an abuse, there is a violation of human rights involved. Smuggling is different. Migrants pay to have that kind of service. So there is consensus. So it's a completely different scenario. So if there is such a high demand for smuggling services, and it's growing and growing, just saying that this should not happen is not the right response, I think.
Hi, thank you for coming and talking to us. So I was wondering if there's any specific group, whether it be religious or ethnic or anything that you've noticed, who tend to use the passeurs more often than other groups, whether it be maybe the Jewish after World War II, or if there are any more groups that stand out in today's world.
There have been different waves, so, and also, because illegal migration is illegal, it's very hard to find traces, like official traces of these passages. So Casigine is one bit, we could not call it official, but we have the work of, for the previous waves of migration, we have the work of historians who have been tracing those passages, maybe collecting letters. For example, Renata Brogini that I mentioned, she did a great job in collecting the letters of Jewish migrants during World War II, so that's certainly one case. It really depends on the geopolitical context. And there have been different waves. I want to say now, so talking to Maria Paola Rotino, she told me, especially Africans from North Africa, the Sub-Saharan countries as well, Afghanistan, Syrians. So these are the groups that are more active. But what is interesting is that these groups are very active, both in terms of migration, but also in terms of smuggling. And now you can read on the news really very, very often that maybe an ex-migrant from Pakistan is now was working as a passeur, and then he got caught, because this is also for them a kind of knowledge that they can use to make some form of profit. So has it happened before with Italians, Sicilians, or Southern Italians migrating to France and then selling their service to the people from the same village they came from? The same thing is happening now. But I really think that besides the nationality of these migrants and smuggling, the practices, the dynamics are pretty much always the same.
Thank you, like everybody else. I am the son of two immigrants from Colombia and Venezuela. So immigration has always been a conversation in my family. I wanted to know if you could draw, or in the time that you've been here in America, have you been able to draw any comparisons between what the conversation is in Europe and what it is here? That's my question. And then also, I had another part to my question. So also, in my experience, whenever I see somebody talk, speak about topics like you with this type of passion, they usually have a connection, like a personal relationship to their work. I was wondering if you had something that started your interest in this.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I wish I knew more about the American context to really make a thorough comparison. I think there are resonance, though, between the political discourses on migration that we hear in the U.S. and in Europe. Criminalization of migrants, 100%. I have not done a specific research on criminalization of smugglers, but I think it might be because what I heard a lot about here is maybe like children traveling by themselves, or it's more independent migrants that just go and cross the border, whereas in the Mediterranean, across the Alps, because of the landscape and the geographical conditions, you do need somebody who takes you. So you do need somebody who makes you cross the Mediterranean. You do need somebody who makes you cross the Alps. When these people try by themselves, most of the times it doesn't work. They actually die. So I think maybe that's the main difference. The second question, so why I got interested into this topic. So I started with books. I started just reading biographies of migrants coming to Italy because Italy has always been a country of emigration, and immigration is very recent. It's a very recent phenomenon that started in the 90s. So we have these new Italians that are now changing the idea of the Italian identity. And because I didn't know anybody, my way of approaching this new subjects or people was through books. And then I was active at the University of Bologna, just reading biographies, migrant narratives. And then I got very interested into this topic. I started reading on migration, both legal and illegal, and then I got very, very interested into the illegal migration because I come from a very small town in the internal area of Italy. Like, it's also a very like a mountainous area, so very similar to the Alps. It's not the Alps, but it's the Apennines, so it's the central area close to Rome. Very small town, and I was honestly shocked when I saw migrants from Africa coming to my hometown and being hosted in my hometown. Like, in my mind, especially while living abroad, my hometown had never changed, so I would just go back home and see things as they used to be. And seeing these new people coming, I was used to see migrants in the city, but in my hometown, never seen before, and I really realized that was an anthropological change that was going on. And I really, really wanted to see how that would affect ideas of national identity and local identity, because that's also very interesting now. So the cities and small towns do not respond to this kind of pressures or just phenomenon in the same way. There are different dynamics. And Ventimiglia is one of that case where everybody was involved, but because it's also a peripheral, small area, and they just react in a different way. So because of that, I got involved. I volunteered as an Italian teacher to asylum seekers in my hometown. I did it for just a month, a very brief time. I was in the US, so I went back. I was in Italy for the summer, so I could do that for a month. And I learned so much, just hearing these people's stories, and but also seeing what kind of what expects them once they come to Italy. So I don't know much about all the bureaucracy, but I could see like what kind of structure, for example, what kind of activities, what kind of expectations, even for example the time you need to wait before having a response for your request of asylum, for example. It should take 6 months, but then this is just in theory, it should take 6 months, then it always takes longer. And this is how I realized just treating this phenomenon as an emergency is not going to take us anywhere, because we should expect that this phenomenon is going to continue for a long time. So if we just organize in a better way, and we are more prepared to welcome these people and also guide them through all the process, but also guide them towards something else. Because something that happens that I've seen is that for people who do not, for people whose request of asylum is not accepted, their fate after that is very uncertain, but also it's very unclear, because these people should be deported and brought back to their country, but this is very expensive, very, very expensive. So this happens actually very rarely. So most of the times, migrants who are not accepted as refugees in Italy just wander around the country and live on the street, or maybe they work, but in a very unofficial scenario or setting. So these people still stay in the country. We should make them visible and try to understand how to make their life, acknowledged and how to say that? Just see what's going on without pretending that this is not happening, because this, I think, is the result of this populist rhetoric. We just pretend that these migrants are not coming to Italy. We just pretend that we can close the ports. We cannot close the ports. Maybe we can do it once. We can do it twice or 3 times. But then these people are still coming, and you can't stop them. So I think it's better if we can just find a different solution. It's not easy, but we should try.